Welcome to today's session. As I had mentioned, we are going to go through a number of practice exercise questions on Python functions and modules. So if you want to have these questions, they are already listed on this link. You can easily get them in this section. All right. So we have about 16 questions and we are going to go through each of the questions. All right. So the goal of going through all these questions is to give us at least an understanding of working with Python functions and modules. And of course, as we have already seen from our previous sessions, like even if we are dealing with Python functions and modules, we still need an understanding of the previous topics that we have already covered. Okay, so we are going to start with the very first question here. All right, so we are going to start with this question here that requires us to write a Python function that calculates and returns the square of a given number. All right. So a function. I hope we clearly remember how to do a function. As we had illustrated in our previous session, we talked of the way to define a function by calling def, that keyword, then give your function a name. All right. So, and we said that at least try to make the name relevant based on what the function is meant to achieve. So in this case, since we have to calculate and return the square of a given number, we can talk about square being the name of our function. Then we have the parentheses, and then in here, we decide if we need to pass in some parameters or we do not need to pass in any parameters. All right, but seeing the nature of the problem that we have, we are required to create a function that calculates and returns the square of a given number. All right, so in here, I can pass in an argument. I'm calling it num. All right, so in here I can simply talk about, let me just have square. All right, then I can simply have num, and since we are doing the square, I can have the double asterisk, then 2. All right, so if you remember, this is supposed to give us the square of num. Then in here we can simply return square. All right, and of course, you are not restricted in here. I will still demonstrate on a number of ways you can use to get the square of the given number. All right. So you have declared a function, given it a name, and passed in a parameter. Then you have indicated what the function is supposed to do here. It's supposed to multiply or rather get the square of num, then return that square. All right. So having done that, for us to get this task done, we need to call this function. Remember? Okay, so to call this function, we said you do that, you mention the name of the function, then in here, our function, having passed this num parameter, our function expects us to pass in some parameter, right? So in here, I can talk about the square of 10. All right, and the question is, if I execute this program, will I get the expected output? Let me see. All right, I don't get anything because in here we asked our function to just return this. All right, but since we want to see the output of our function on the console, we need to print. We need to print. We need to print that. All right. So better still, we could have assigned this function to some variable here, square number. Let me just have something like that. Then in here, I can simply print square number, square num. All right. So in here, I want to demonstrate a number of ways of achieving this square. So this is one of them, and especially for this particular line here. So you can simply multiply your number or rather raise your number to power 2. All right. So the other approach, you can have square is equals to, remember, squaring simply means multiplying a number by itself. So I can simply have num times num. All right. And since we still have 10 here, let me still execute that and see. All right. We still get the same response. All right. So the third approach is making use of the math module. Remember, we can import math here. Okay. Then in here, I come in and talk of square is equals to math dot. So we can have, I think, okay. So there is no square, but I think we have power. All right. Whereby we pass in the number and the power in which we want to raise that number to. So remember, by squaring, we simply means raising that number to power 2. All right. Let's still test this and see if we get 100. Right. So in this case, this gives us a float number, but then the value is still the same. This is 100. So just use whichever method you want to use, and I hope it's not a hard one. All right, so in here we have another task to come up with a function that takes a person's name as input and prints a greeting message. Okay, okay, so we write a function that takes a person's name as input and prints a greetings message. All right. So let me just start by defining a function. At least we, in mind, we already have an architecture of what we are supposed to come up with. Then the next thing is putting down our idea to try and see if it will work in our favor. And of course, should we get errors, we try to change whatever we have written down, and eventually we should get something that works. All right, so let me define a function called greetings. All right. So in here, we can pass in something. All right. So in here, I can try to pass in, let me talk about name. Okay. That's a parameter. And this name. So anytime I call this function, it should fetch the name from the user. So remember, we have been using um, the input function to get some input from the user. Enter your name. All right. Then in here, we should return something. Let me talk of greet, and I should greet my user. Right? So remember how to use this formatting of strings. So I can talk of hello, then pass in the name. All right, then I can simply return. I can return greet. Okay, so let us try to call this function. So the question is, like now that I'm supposed to call this function, what should be the parameter in here? Because I can't just pass in the name as it is. All right. So for now, let me try something out. Let me have name and pass in an empty string and see how this one works. All right. Let's try this out together and see. So pass in a name. I'm Daniel. All right. So let me try to print this instead. Okay, so that we can get some output. Name. All right. Hello, Daniel. So by setting an empty string here, um, we get, or rather we have passed in an empty string here. Then what happens, whatever we assigned is overridden by the new entry that we have here. All right. So this is basically like defining a default value, so that in case, for instance, let me see. So whatever you pass in here will be, in case we don't correct the user input, then whatever comes in here will be printed on our console. All right. So let me try to do away with that and see what we get. All right. So probably it is trying to print hello empty string in here. So even if I print, let me just have a D there, right? So whatever you input here, it goes in here. All right. So in this case, what you need to understand is that you can either um, call the name and assign something, or directly assign whatever data that you want to make use of in our function. All right. So back now to our question. We want to have a function that takes the person's name as input and prints a greetings message. All right. So we have already done that. This is how to do it. Remember here we mentioned that since we want to make use of the user input, you can input a dummy name here because it will be overridden by what we have here. Alternatively, if you so wish, you can pass in an empty string as we have here, and then should ask you for the name, and then it will replace the empty strings with the name. The other option, that's one of the approach that we can give. I also want us to look at another approach. So the next approach is, let me just have that. So it is not a must that we pass in a parameter in there. Okay, so we can just do that, then just have the name and request the user to input their name. Then we greet the user, or rather we pass in the greetings and pass in the name, then proceed to return the greet. All right. Then when calling our function, we do not need to pass in anything. Okay. So let's do that. Daniel. Okay. So we see we still get the same output. So as long as the problem does not require you to pass a parameter, it's not a must that you pass one. But again, even if you do, at least we have seen how you can be able to handle such a problem. Okay. Then right, I think that's it for that question. Number 3. So in here we are supposed to define a function that takes a number as input and checks if it is even or odd. So another interesting question here. Okay, so let us start first by appreciating how we can tell if a number is even or odd. So for instance, let me try to pull my Python console here. All right, so in here, I want us to, for instance, 4. We said for you to check if a number is odd or even, we said that even numbers are numbers that are divisible by 2. And for us to check for the divisibility test, we just have 4, we use the modulus operator, 2. So if we get a 0, this number here, this number 4, simply tells us that it is divisible by 2. And in that case, it's an even number. So if we do a test with 8, we get a 0, so that's an even number. So in case we try 7, all right, we get 1. So that tells us that that is an odd number. So in case you know this, then the question becomes easier. All right. Otherwise, if you don't know this, then you will not be able to handle this question. All right. So let's create the function. So as always, we are always going to be starting with that keyword def, right? So we want to define a function, then give the function a name. So I can call it number checker, num checker, right? Then I can decide that in this case, I will not pass in a parameter. Okay, I will not pass in a parameter because I want to get the number from the user. Input, then enter a number. Okay, then I would deliberately leave something out, and I would expect that at least somebody will spot it out. So in here, I'll come and check if num. All right, I use the modulus operator by 2 is equals to 0. Then we need to have okay. So in here, I can just talk about. Okay, let me see how best I can have it. So I can assign. Okay, so I can talk about number state. All right, so number state, I can create an empty string there, whereby if this number is an even number, I can update the number state by saying that I can simply have the F formatting, and I'll say num is an even number. All right. So basically, a number can either be even or odd. I mean, we only have those two options. So in here, I can just talk about else. I can update the number state by saying number, whichever number that comes in is an odd number. All right. So I might have deliberately left something out. I'm hoping somebody is able to spot it out. So let's try to execute this program. So even before we get to execute, so this is our function, and then we should go ahead and call the function. So we called our function numChecker, so I should do that. But again, okay, so once I do this, this function will not return anything because it is only supposed to update num state. So we are not going to get any output even if we print the output of this. So what we need to do is so basically we are out of the of this if statement block. All right, so we just need to print num state. Not printing, I prefer return. All right, then basically num state is simply the state of that number. Is it even, is it odd? All right, even. All right, so let me try to execute this, and I'm expecting that somebody should tell me that I missed out on something. Right, we get an error. Anybody who is able to spot why we getting this error? So I'll still pull my console here and I show you something. So let me just have an X here, and I'll talk about input. So I'll tell this user enter a number. All right, so I want to check whether the number that comes in is even or odd. All right, by subjecting whichever number that comes in to this check here. So I'll do that and I'll type in 10. Okay, so we know that x is equals to 10. But then if I do x, I have the modulus operator by 2, right? I get an error. And I hope you're also able to spot how this 10 looks like. Remember, we have mentioned this over and over again that whenever you get an input from the user, it does not always come in as an integer. Basically, every input will come in as a string. So that's why you're saying when we try to print 10, it is in quotes because it has come in as a string. So for this test to at least be return something positive without throwing an error, we need to convert the input to an integer. So we can have integer x, then that 2. All right, and we see at least it is able to give the expected output. So back to our problem here. So this input, this comes in as a string. So we need to convert that to an integer by just doing this. Okay, so let me clear that and run our program. Enter a number, 10. Okay, so we see that 10 is an even number. I select 23 is an odd number. I already do that. 79, odd number. Do that, a bigger number, and we see that's an even number. So it should be as simple as we have it here. It is not supposed to be that hard. So the thing is, I mean, we are talking about functions and modules, but as you have noted, we can do without data types. All right. And you also see we are also making use of trying to make decisions using if, else, and all that. So this tells you that for you to be able to really appreciate what we are doing currently, you also need to appreciate what we have been doing. Otherwise, everything might seem new here. All right. All right. So actually, you can collapse this. All right. So we are supposed to develop a function that will calculate the area of a rectangle, allowing users to specify the length and the width. So I believe you all know how to get the area of a rectangle, whereby we just talk about the area being length times width. All right. So let's talk about area is equals to length multiplied by width. All right. So we need to have a function that whenever this function is called, it will prompt the user to enter the length and the width. Once they input those two parameters, then our function should return the area. All right, so let's define, and we need to give our function a name, area rectangle. You can just have such a short form or just type in the full name, area rectangle. All right, then in here I can pass in the length and width. All right, so all right, so let's do it this way. As I mentioned, some of these questions are kind of open-ended. You can decide to pass in parameters or do without them. So let's approach this question and have the parameters in place, then also do it without having to mention these parameters. All right, so in here we can have the length, whereby we are going to request the user to input the length. So we have input, then enter length. All right, then let's have the width, let's have input, enter width. But of course in here we can ensure that the user has the required instructions. For instance, enter width in meters. All right, so that the user does not end up entering in some other uh, type of measurement. All right, so with these two, we expect to get the length and the width. Then in here, we can simply have the area. We can simply have this. All right, and we eventually return area. All right, so having passed in the length and the width, we need to kind of, when calling this function, we need to acknowledge that, yes, we need to pass in some parameters. So area rectangle, we can pass in the length. So we can pass in anything. I mean, say default values. All right. And in this case, since we are talking about return, we should print this so that the output appears on our console. Enter the length in meters. So we want 12, and I also want 10. All right. So we still missed out on a very key aspect. All right, of converting this to an integer. As you can see here, they are giving us a hint because they are saying we can't multiply sequence of non-integer, or rather we can't multiply or can't multiply sequence by non-integer of type string. So we need to convert this to integer. We also need to do this here. Then execute our program. 10 can have 12. We see 120. So all these values in here that we passed are only treated as default values. All right. So they are just in here because our function was already expecting us to pass in some values. But again, after entering the new length and the width, we are going to make use of the new values. All right. I also mentioned in here, let me show you. So instead of again passing them as 10, 10 and 10, you can simply have the length 10 and the width, at least something you are able to see. Okay, for rectangle, at least let's work with not just 10, 10. At least we have two different values because again, if it's 10, 10, then it's no longer a rectangle but a square. All right, so you can make your function beautiful if at all it has some multiple parameters by, at least having them in this way. But again, even if we have them in this way, it still does not affect the way these numbers are overridden by the new values that we get here. If you do not want to have all this, let me just comment out here. All right. And as I mentioned, you can simply have that, but then remove these parameters. All right. So once we remove the parameters, so when calling the function, remember, you don't need to pass in the parameters. Execute this again. Have 15, have 10. All right. 150. So it's as simple as that. All right, so in here, we are supposed to do a function that accepts temperature in Celsius and returns the equivalent temperature in Fahrenheit. So we are being tested on two aspects. So the first one, even before you start attempting to do your function, you should at least know how to convert temperature from Celsius to Fahrenheit. All right. So let us first of all try to understand how that happens because this is not really Python related. All right. Let's see. So we simply see that 0 degrees is equals to 32. All right. So how about 1? So, all right. So here is the formula. Actually, we have the formula here. So this is what we should now substitute. All right. So we are going to refer to this formula here. And again, it's not a crime if you don't know it because it might not be in line with what you are currently doing. All right. So let's see how to substitute this formula. Fahrenheit is given by that we have 1, we multiply by 9 over 5, then we add 32. All right. So again, this one here, this one is the degrees. All right. So in case we are talking about, say, like 20 degrees, we should replace that here. So instead of 1, replace it with degree. All right. Let's now create a program or a function that turns what we have here. All right. So we are still going to come back to this page to validate what we get. All right. So let's define. So it will accept temperature in Celsius. All right. So let me talk about degree. Let me use degree here. All right. Then do we need to take in some parameter? Maybe not. All right. So we can just come in here and talk about. So let me take the degree from the user input temperature. So in this case, we can have float. I'm not sure if it's gonna work. Input, enter temperature in degrees. All right. So once that temperature comes in, let's talk about Fahrenheit is equals to the temperature that comes in. We need to multiply that by 9 over 5. Once we do that, we add 32. Then in here, we are supposed to return Fahrenheit. And again, you can simply do, okay, let me have some string here. So I'll have temp converted to Fahrenheit is whatever we get here. So I can simply return this. No harm. Return. All right. So again, we can have this assigned to a variable or as it is. So I'm hoping this one works for us. So even before we start doing that, at least I need to validate that we are able to convert a string to a float, because let me try. Let me have an input here. If it's 10, then I talk about float x. Interesting. All right. So let's now proceed to test our function. Let me have degree and I execute that. So in that case, let me just print. All right. So let's do a test. All right. So I have 20. Right. So 20, let me say 20 degrees converted converted to Fahrenheit is 30, or rather it's 68. Let me check that here. 20, 68. Okay, perfect. All right, let's try something else. 50 degrees, we have 122. Let me have 50 here. All right, we have 122. And again, in case we have 100 degrees converted to Fahrenheit is 212. If we have 100 here, all right, so that is it. That is how to go about it. Again, if we were to talk about receiving a parameter, you just have the temp here, then remove this request to take the input from the user. And again, the reason why I passed in whatever we have here. Let me again see. because for instance, let me have like 12.5. Did it work? All right, 12.5. So 12.5 here, 12.5. You see, it's 54.5. 54.5. All right, so let me show you the difference as to why I had to use float instead of integer. Let me replace this with int. All right, and run this program. I have 12.5. Let me pull my Python console here, and I want to convert to an integer. 12.5 again, that should be. So see, we have it at 12. So we will have lost some value. All right, and if we check here, 12.5, if we remove the 0.5, let us see what happens to our 54.5. Right? So our 54.5 becomes 53.6. So that's why I had to put it on float. And again, there is an error trying here to convert whatever comes in as a string to integer. All right. So in such a case, let us stick by converting that to a float to avoid losing some value. All right, so that is simply how we should approach this question. We are required to develop a function that takes a list of numbers and returns the maximum value in the list. All right, so the first question would be, do you know how to get the maximum value in a given list? So if you are, then this should be simple. All right, so let's have def defined. So we can have max val. All right, then in here we can accept x, and at the back of our mind we know that x is supposed to be a list. All right, then in here we can just have the max value. We can have max value to be max of x, and we can simply return to our Python console. We have x being a list. All right, so if I print x, if I pass x to the max function, it gives us the max value. All right, so in that case, let's come back here, and whatever we did is what is expected of us. I just wanted to show you where this max is coming from. This is what we are supposed to do to get the max value from a given list. So again, we can simply print max val. Then in here we pass in a list. All right, so the list can be 2, 6, 9, 8, and all that. So by just the look of things, we expect to get 9 as the output. All right, so see, we get 9. If we change something to 18, execute again, we see 18. If we change again to 92, execute again, we see that the maximum is 92. So it should be as simple as that. Takes a list of numbers and returns. So that should be it. All right, so in here we can talk about define. So we are supposed to create a function that will accept a string and a number n and return a string repeated n times. So we can have the function we call n times, and it will accept a string. I can talk about, let me just name it a string. All right, then I can pass in n there. All right. So let me again bring my Python console here. I can for now exit, clear the screen, go back there. All right. So we want to talk of high. High. All right. I want to multiply that by 3. All right. So again, if you want high to at least have some space, you can add some space there. All right. And we have that. So no magic is required. You just need to have the string and the integer. Again, remember we cannot multiply strings and strings. We can only multiply, in this case, we can only multiply a string and an integer. If we try to multiply a high, see what we get. So if you acknowledge this, then this question becomes a little bit easier because what we get is, so I can simply return here. I can simply return the string times n, return n times. Then in here, I'm supposed to pass in, let me have hello. Then n times, I want 10 times. All right, so let's try it out. So we see we have hello probably 10 times. I believe this should be 10. So in case I want that space, I can simply have that space there. Execute the program again, and we see we have hello 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Alternatively, I can have hello 3 times. Do that, and we see hello 3 times. All right, have that number 9 and do that. So in here, we are supposed to write a function that takes two strings as input and returns a new string that concatenates the two inputs. All right. So remember, from these other questions, the fact that we are defining or we are passing these parameters in here. Remember, we are not restricted in getting those inputs from the user. So you can have the user give you these parameters or just pass them in here. All right. So in here, you can define add strings. That's the name of my function. And I'll have string 1 and string 2. Okay. Then in here, I can have concat strings. I mean, just a simple name. Let me just have concat. Then I'll simply have string 1 plus string 2. All right, so let me pull my console here. We have high plus there. All right, so it is possible to add two strings. Okay, so having known that, come back to your function here, and you can easily have, you can easily have, so I'll just return concat. Actually, I wanted to have concat, not contact. All right, so then here I can simply print. I can simply print add strings, and now add two strings. I can have high there. All right, then execute your program. So and returns a new string that concatenates the two inputs. So this is what we have. And again, um, you must not leave a space, but again, the output will not make sense. So if at all you want the output to make sense, you can have that space. So either have that space or this one. At least any of those should give a very nice output.